system. This is a neuron. A neuron is a basic cell of the nervous system. The cell body is also known as the soma. The dendrite are the extensions from the soma that collect information from its surroundings and bring the message into the cell body. These are the dendrites. The message goes in this direction. The axon is the one extension that brings the message from the cell body out to the next location. This would be the axon, and the direction of the message goes this way. In a neuron, the message will only go in one direction. The neurolemma is the special name for the cell membrane of a neuron. The neurolemma you will not have to identify in a picture. The myelin sheath forms around the axon. It's formed from Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes, depending on where you're located. Many of the axons of a neuron are insulated, and that insulation is called the myelin sheath. So these kind of bumps here on the axon make up the myelin sheath. Schwann cells are the cells that actually make up the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is made out of Schwann cells. These are the Schwann cells here, and they are wrapped around the axon. The nodes of Ranvier are the areas between the Schwann cells and the message will travel from the cell body and will jump from node to node down the axon. Neuroglial cells are support cells for the nervous system. Microglial cells clean up the nervous system. These are microglial cells here. Oligodendrocytes form the myelin sheath. This is the oligodendrocyte here and here. This is the myelin sheath. You can see that it wraps around that axon. An astrocyte is found between a blood vessel and the neuron itself, and it will nourish the neuron. The neuron is so specialized that it can't feed itself, so it has a specialized cell to get the food from the blood vessel and bring it to the neuron. Ependymal cells are a lining cell. These are the ependymal cells here. We have white matter and gray matter. White matter is called white matter because it looks white. In this picture of a brain here, the white matter would be this area here. White matter has a myelin sheath, so these are insulated. Gray matter are uninsulated cells, so there is no myelin sheath on these cells. It appears more gray. It appears more gray in color, and this is the gray matter here. The nervous system is divided into two sections. First, we have the central nervous system, or the CNS. It is made of the brain and spinal cord. Then we have the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system would basically be all of the rest of the nerves in the body. There are three major shapes of neurons, and depending on where in the body or the function of these nerves will depend on the shape. Bipolar has the cell body with two extensions, one that contains dendrites and one that is the axon. A unipolar has the cell body here and basically one extension that branches in and then comes back out again, and then multipolar, where there are several extensions from the cell body itself. So bipolar has two extensions from the cell body, unipolar has one extension from the cell body, and a multipolar has several extensions from that cell body. Sensory neurons are also known as afferent neurons. These are the neurons that pick up information from the outside world. They pick up the information and bring that information to the brain or spinal cord. An interneuron is usually found in the spinal cord, and it's kind of the middleman found in between a sensory neuron and the next neuron, which is a motor neuron. A motor neuron is also known as an efferent neuron. This is taking the message from the brain or spinal cord and then sending it out to whatever is doing the effect. It could be a muscle, it could be a gland. Let's talk about a nerve impulse. A nerve at rest has more sodium on the outside and more potassium on the inside of the cell. When a neuron gets stimulated, sodium will enter the cell and the cell will depolarize. Then the potassium will leak out of the cell, repolarizing the cell. Now in a small portion of the membrane, we have sodium on the inside and potassium on the outside, so there's a switch. This causes the next section of membrane to depolarize and repolarize. While the next section will depolarize and repolarize, this one will reset. And then this impulse will travel down that neuron. If we take a look here, we're looking at it as more of a charge. Sodium is more positive than potassium. Potassium is more negative. We have our initial depolarization here. So our positives and our negatives switch. This then causes the next section to polarize and depolarize, and then it will reset and then cause the next section to polarize and depolarize. As a review, sodium enters the cell, making the inside of the cell more positive, and then potassium will leave the cell, making the outside of the cell more negative, depolarizing and repolarizing the cell. Then this will trigger the next section of axon to depolarize and repolarize, and the part that has already depolarized and repolarized will reset. So the sodium will go to the outside of the cell and the potassium will come back into the cell. And this will travel down the axon. The nerve impulse is also called the action potential. So the action potential is the movement of sodium and potassium across the cell membrane. In this picture here, there's a recording electrode that is picking up the change in voltage. When the change finally hits the area where the electrode is, the voltage will rise. When it resets, that voltage will then drop back down, and it kind of undershoots to where it was and then comes back up to the resting potential. So we have our resting potential, we have a depolarization, a repolarization, and undershoot, and then back up to the resting potential. At rest, sodium is on the outside, potassium is on the inside. When we have our action potential, sodium and potassium will switch places, and then they are pumped back to their resting potential state. On an axon that has the myelin sheath or the Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes wrapped around, it's going to only depolarize and repolarize the nodes of Ranvier. It's not going to do the whole thing. This allows for a quicker response. This is called a saltatory impulse. If we had an axon as an A that did not have any Schwann cells, we will have to depolarize and repolarize the whole entire axon. With an myelinated axon, we only have to polarize and depolarize smaller sections, making it a much faster response. Just like a muscle contraction, this is an all or nothing response. Once sodium and potassium start leaking across the cell membranes, you can't stop that, and your nerve is going to fire. Once the message reaches the end of the axon, it's going to come to the synapse. The end of the nerve doesn't actually physically touch the next thing that's there. It could be another nerve, it could be a muscle, it could be a gland. The synapse is the area or the joint between the nerve and whatever's next. At the synapse, in order for the message to get from the nerve to the next thing, there are neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are kept in vesicles. Inside the vesicle are the neurotransmitters. When the impulse reaches the synapse, it activates those vesicles to release the neurotransmitter here, and it will go to the other side. It's going to cross the synaptic cleft. So the actual hole between the nerve and the next thing is called the synaptic cleft, and it's going to reach that receptor on the other side. Once it reaches that receptor, it's going to determine what's going to happen on the other side. That neurotransmitter is then either broken down or it's sent back to the original nerve. There are several different types of neurotransmitters within the body. Here is a small list of neurotransmitters. The first one, acetylcholine, is one that you should already be familiar with. This is the one from the muscle contraction. In a general whole, acetylcholine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are generally either exciting, making something happen, or inhibiting, where it's going to stop something from happening. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Norepinephrine is usually excitatory, and that has to do with being awake, learning, and memory, along with several other different functions. Dopamine is usually inhibitory, and it's usually a feel-good feeling. Dopamine is one of the things that is generally released to help reduce pain. Opiates, such as morphine and Valium, have a very similar chemical structure and will actually mimic dopamine and hit those receptors and kind of give you that feel-good feeling. So when you have a lot of these opiates in your system, and heroin is one of these opiates, you stop making your own natural dopamine because you have so much of the artificial dopamine in your body. So when you are coming down off of your high, your body starts to not feel good and you need more. And that's kind of where the addiction comes in, because it starts to feel not so good when you don't have that dopamine. And since your body has stopped making dopamine naturally, you have to keep supplementing it artificially. Serotonin is an inhibitory. It deals with mood, appetite, and sleepiness. Endorphins are an inhibitory, and this is usually an arousal or mood, pain relief, kind of along the same lines. It works similar to that of the dopamine. And then nitric oxide is a vasodilation. Actually, the male erection is based on nitric oxide. Nitric oxide causes the blood vessels in the penis to actually dilate and causing an erection in males. Viagra increases the amount of nitric oxide within the male body, creating more vasodilation within the penis, and thus being able to have more of an erection.